welcome our guest on virtual stage and the virtual audience at the second part of the seminar. We will try to fit into the topic which is still missing in a Polish discourse, urban restructuring, which is going beyond scientific elaborations. So today we are hosting the most influential and remarkable researchers on urban shrinkage phenomenon, starting with Ilincą Paun Constantinescu, architect linked with Ilincą University of Architecture and Urbanism, Bucharest, and Idealagram Association, the editor of books Shrinking Cities in Romania, Volume 1, Research and Analysis, and Volume 2, Responses and Intervention, published by DOM Publisher and MNAC Press in 2019. And in 2021, together with Idealagrams, she exhibits at Venice Biennale of Architecture with the Romanian pavilion Fading Borders. Straight from the Rust Belt of the US, Terry Schwarz, director of the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative at Kent State University, the one who launched Shrinking Cities Institute, author and editor of variety publications, including Urban Infill series. It's worth to know that Terry was hosting in Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative an exhibition of shrinking cities organized by our next guest, Philippem Oswaltem. And just mentioned, Philippem Oswaltem, initiator of Shrinking Cities Project and editor of Shrinking Cities Volume 1 International Research and Volume 2 Interventions, book published by Jakie in 2006, and co-author of Atlas of Shrinking Cities. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you all here. And finally, let me introduce myself. My name is Bartłomiej Sroka from the Institute of Urban and Regional Development. So, well, the discourse on the urban shrinkage is appearing from time to time when the depopulation process is considered. There are a variety of scopes, points in the discussion, and the discord between arguments used by politicians, scientists, and citizens. However, slightly negative perception is predominant when we are talking about the shrinkage and shrinking cities. Missing fact, lacking statistics, and prejudice are the main obstacles to move on with intervention in the cities. Unfortunately, for most authorities, urban shrinkage used to be deemed as a taboo. So what we discussed in the previous panel is also appealing. Research projects are trying to charm away the negative connotation to the shrinkage. So there is also an opportunity in this phenomenon. There are numerous examples of struggling with depopulation, urban decay, and economic crisis. When the negative impressions are turned into new development perspective for a city, even a progress with no growth, so as the main topic of IBA. So taking a step back to research projects, and the keynote of the seminar is how we could move on from research to a real projects in shrinking cities. So I guess there are still missing linkage between output of research and debate on the policies, urban policies, and urban restructuring programs, especially in the Eastern Europe. The point is that in Germany, there were, let's say, some turning points in the discussion, like mentioned before, International Architecture Exhibition, IBA, and publications such as Shrinking Cities series. So let's start with a question to Philip. You have been leading various projects, including Urban Catalyst about temporary development and shrinking cities, the main project. Your research was ongoing during a period of shaping of Statenbau. So this is the governmental program. Finally, both Statenbau Ost and Shrinking Cities project appeared almost simultaneously. So there was an interplay between these two initiatives?
Loosely, very loosely. So the first project was actually Urban Catalyst, which came out of my work on Berlin. I have to say, maybe for the background, I'm born in Frankfurt-Main in West Germany and moved to Berlin in West in 1984 to start my architectural studies. And in Berlin, we have had, after the German reunification, 1990, very intense development, both in urban development, but also development of urban discussion. And we have had a very conservative, not even to say nationalistic turn in 1901 with Hans Stimmern, which tried to push the idea not only of the so-called European city, but also about Prussian style and Berlinish architecture, whatever that is supposed to be. And I was among the critiques of this new agenda, which was very powerful because it was a kind of part of state policy. And after a time I spent in the Netherlands, I came back to Berlin in 1998. And I have had the will to kind of do something about my fascination and identification with the Berlin as it was. And there was a big split in between the real development of urban life in Berlin and the architectural policy, because the urban life in Berlin, and I think that you will have similar phenomena in other parts of Eastern Europe. People enjoyed very much kind of the loose control after there was some kind of loose control after the state change of government. I mean, even so, West Germany was overtaking the East, so to say. There was still kind of in this process of transition, there was some kind of looseness of control, and especially about unclarified ownerships and so on. And Berlin was in the time after the World War II, I mean, not only have had a lot of vacancies because of war demolition, but also about kind of car-friendly planning and also lack of economic development. So there was a lot of kind of unclear urban conditions in the city center, which was absorbed by different kind of programs and activities. And that was actually becoming urbanistically very interesting. And this intensified after 1990 with a kind of club culture and art culture, but also a culture of migrant activities like the so-called Poolmarkt, which was a phenomenon of around 1990, even before the war came down. And so that was part of my analysis of Berlin, which was produced in the book Berlin, City Without Form, which also recently was now published in English. And there was an intention after this book to pursue the work on the subjects, especially on the question of the temporality. And together with two friends of mine, with Klaus Obermeier and Philipp Misselwitz, actually, I started with Klaus, so we applied for European funding, and this was approved, and so we could do the project Urban Catalyst in the years 2001 and 2003, which was extending on the potential of temporality in the urban development. And I mean, temporality, not in the sense to be really ephemeral, but kind of to have another take of urban development by things which are not initiated by kind of investment in built structures, but more by initiating programs and to take it from there. And in doing that, I maybe kind of became more known for my interest in urban questions. And so I was approached by the Stiftung Bauhaus Dessau at the time, because they have been the Saxony-Anhalt, so this is a country in Eastern Germany, and they was facing this big vacancies and had been asked by the ministry to come up with ideas how to address these big vacancies. And so I made, also together with Klaus, a project for them regarding shrinking cities, which became the basis for the IBA Saxony-Anhalt, which was started, I think, 2001 and ended 2010. And then I was asked to make a proposal also. It's nice, this Ilincą kind of ended up in the Venice Biennale. I was asked to make a project for the Venice Biennale, to make a proposal for the Venice Biennale, which is kind of in charge of the Ministry of Construction of Building in Germany. But I was not selected. 5 people got asked, another project was selected. So it was refused, and but the cultural ministry was interested in the project. And so I was approached by the Cultural Foundation, and they enabled the project with quite substantial funding. And that was this possibility to do the project. So there is some intertwine, but the projects kept, in a sense, separate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think the temporary issue is kind of a linkage, but I guess we will turn on to this one later. Yeah. There was also a very nice book, Self-Made City Berlin, initiatives, and also in literature, Leipzig is used to be called as a Mecca of temporary uses. Yeah, so I think that topic will appear later on. And now I would like to ask Ilincą about her experience. Like, as we know, in Germany and in the US, the issue of shrinkage, let's say, is well known and quite, let's say, dominant a bit in the let's say, in urban policies since last 2 decades. But how about Romania? Is also your publication, your book changed a bit the discourse? That topic is appealing now more widely, like politicians taking also some comments about it, the citizens, about how it was. How was the impression also after the exhibition that was also a part of these 2 volumes of shrinking cities in Romania?
Thank you for the question, Bartolome. And just let me tell you that I'm so happy to be in this companion, and it's so wonderful to see Philippe again and to meet Terry today. Now, just I think the presentations that occurred before, they gave a little bit of context that is somehow similar in many ways, but not completely, but anyway, in many ways to the Romanian situation. So we presented publicly for the first time in 2016 at a contemporary art museum, and that's very important because it was this perspective from this side, but that presented an urban reality that was based on a research that implied numbers. So you had this association between something that would not be contested, but you would also have this more flexible and creative vision on it. But anyway, so the purpose of that exhibition was to raise awareness about this too little discussed phenomenon of shrinking cities, and anyway to state the overall resulting need to redefine the role, so the urban policies and the role of the architecture and urban planning in Romania. And I must say that you were asking if there was a change in the public discourse. So on the one hand, I have to tell you that the phenomenon of shrinkage in Romania is majoritary. So it occurs to most towns and cities in Romania. But however, the discourse is always, but not only in the administrative and in the politics, but also in the School of Architecture. So there is this mirage for a discussion that is always focused on growth processes and on the idea that modernization and a good lifestyle and is always equal to growth. However, there was a reaction after the publication of the Shrinking Cities books. And this might seem as a timid start, but it is still a start at a political level, meaning that the Ministry of Public Works and Development and Administration has ordered for the World Bank to start a study that would be included in the Urban Policy of Romania 2020-2035. And that included a chapter that I was part in delivering it and researching and studying it, that was called Cities in Transition, a literature review of urban shrinkage and its implications for Romania. So it's just a timid start, I would say, but it is still a start. And I'm sure that the fact that there was an exhibition on that and the publication on that had a role on that. But there is a public discourse of disregard towards these cities. There is that makes them seem unattractive, and that I mean, in my opinion, that is one of the main problems, that it makes them seem unattractive, even for architects and urban planners, you know, in the public discourse. Yes. But anyway, I wanted to point out that while this public discourse is always about powerful and about the major, reality is not characterized by that. It's not even characterized by that. So its characteristics are rather the smaller, the domestic scale that is reflected in the built environment, but major strength that the Romanian towns possess. So yes, that would be my answer for that.
Yes, also I think that's the point, that when the government and the local municipalities, they have statistics, they cannot move on with polemics that they treat it as a taboo, or they said, no, it's not a big deal, like some depopulation and stuff. And also from the other side, the marketing, and that's what the Leipzig, what they did, like this idea of Leipzig Freiheit. So they create the whole marketing about the shrinking city, that this is the new quality of the city, that you can go there, you have cheaper rentals, there is a lot of opportunities that you can do by your own. So yeah, I think I think this is about the change of the, let's say, the approach to the city and the whole image. What is the shrinkage?
Yes, and just for a little thing that I would like to add is that it's very difficult to change a set of mind that is so deeply implemented, as in all the approaches are based exclusively on competition rather than on a cooperation, or on a cooperation at all levels. I mean, coming from the citizens and the practitioners, and also on just a question that might be so simple and basic, but that is never answered to: for whom are we going to build? Who is going to live in that city? Who is going to use that structure? I mean, I know that it might seem banal, but that is often the question that is never that never receives an answer to. So yes.
Thank you very much. So now let's cross the ocean to get the perspective of the Rust Belt. Terry, Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative is well known from numerous projects in shrinking cities and in the area, especially in the area of American Great Lakes. How did you came to idea of Shrinking Cities Institute?
In the US, the Community Design Center movement arose in the 1970s and 80s in response to the fact that private sector architecture firms rarely address the concerns and issues prevalent in distressed neighborhoods and distressed cities. There is a big gap. And so many centers like ours sprung up in the 70s and 80s to respond to this challenge. And so in a lot of ways, our center was created to serve communities that are experiencing big problems. Most of the places where we work have high degrees of poverty, extensive disinvestment, lots of social challenges. And so in many ways, the challenges of shrinking cities became visually apparent first in the communities that we were created to serve. And so even though by 2008, when the foreclosure crisis, brought similar challenges to neighborhoods and cities across the country, we were already working on those issues just because of the nature of the communities that we were, that we serve. It's interesting too, in the midst of the pandemic, a lot of the challenges of shrinking cities, of shrinking neighborhoods that we've been thinking about for 15 years or more at this point, started to become apparent in some of the big cities in the US that you normally associate with growth. New York saw this epic out-migration during the height of the pandemic. And so these challenges of vacant buildings and underutilized infrastructure that we've been wrestling with for a long time became more prevalent elsewhere. I will say that, even in Cleveland, where our center is based, our city still has a growth association. The goal of encouraging economic development, attracting new businesses and residents is still very much part of the political discourse. But it just felt like, because of the nature of what we do is to kind of complement what's happening, filling the gaps in practice. And so since there was already a growth association, the Shrinking Cities Institute was really intended to look at the other half of the equation. I won't say the opposite, because most cities are growing and shrinking simultaneously, just in different ways. But that's where it came from, just that there was this gap that needed to be addressed that's just evident in the population statistics and also the growing inventory of vacant land and buildings that we're seeing in cities throughout the Great Lakes.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that's the issue that also you mentioned, that somehow the growth paradigm is very very popular in the cities. And one of the book of our colleagues, Emilia Jaroszewska, she was writing down about the case study of Wałbrzych, and they really know that the economic situation is really bad, and so many people just flew after the closure of coal mining, and they decided to, let's say, quite reverse economy. They open new economic zones, but also there is a problem. If you coming from one monofunctional way, like mining, to another that you building one plant or one, let's say, a section of the economics, and you will develop it. So another fail, and you're losing the base of the city. And then you have also the same problems with in different quarters in different parts of the city that the deterioration and the blight is appealing there.
This is very true.
Yeah, well, yeah, and the next question, maybe I will ask Ilincą about the let's say the issues from the book. Like you are touching a lot the temporary uses. I mean, also what the Philip said. You've been describing post-mining Petrila in U Valley, which is a very well-known post-mining area in the Carpathian Mountains. Also, there are examples from cities on like Braila on river on the bank of Danube. Is that any universal key for supporting shrinking cities and implementation of the projects there? What do you think? The temporary uses are the key, Ilincą?
Okay, so I would like to explain just a little bit how our research and approach, what were their aspects. So because it's very important that we worked on three aspects at a time. So on the one hand, there was this this research from the distance that used a lot of data, and that also used historical plans and understanding how the cities grew and how they degrew afterwards. So that relationship and to understand what was the engine of the city, because in most of the cases we were dealing with mono-industrial areas or areas that were focused on a major economic engine that later died and so on. So there was this huge transformation that one needed to understand, and you always needed to look in the past as well, and to understand and embrace the recent past, and this might be something that occurs in Poland as well. But at the same time, we were working with the realities. So we visited at least 60 towns and cities, and we were trying to understand what were the recurrent, because you were asking about if there were any recurring effects that would be either negative or maybe positive. And at the same time, with all of these, we started to engage into some interventions that later transformed into small-scale projects. Because continuing the answer to my first question, so you understood the big picture that there is a rather big absence of top-down concerns. A top-down concern that would imply an integrated approach, yes, that would deal with the whole town or city, and that would involve all those many perspectives and fields. So we started to work in Petrila, but then later on we were involved in more towns. In the Shrinking Cities book, there are, I think, 4 case studies. For the Biennale, we added some case studies. So because you were asking about temporality, so I'm trying to answer more things at a time. So on the one hand, in this absence of the top-down, all these initiatives that might be, I don't know, might be labeled as bottom-up, but they might be also labeled as a reflection of a real need. Yeah, so there is a very real diagnosis. So it's like working directly directly with the local community, yes, because there is a problem that is expressed directly from that city. Network of initiatives that has taken shape in Romania in the last, I don't know, 10 years. So it's very recent, but I think it's very interesting and important to follow. And I think that any urban policy should take that into consideration as maybe the best diagnosis. You know? So Terry mentioned earlier that there were some effects that started to show in the urban tissue, and so there are these negatively perceived aspects that, of course, they are very differently perceived in a city like Berlin, as Philip mentioned in the beginning, this effervescence of, this whole potential that those vacancies had for cultural milieu, I don't know, and of course that they're very differently perceived in towns and cities that are already labeled as, you know, those formerly communist towns. So it's very difficult to understand that everything is a heritage, that everything is an asset. So I'm trying to explain how and why we selected the cities that we selected in the book, because I repeat that in Romania, this phenomenon is happening to almost any town and city. But of course that we are also dealing with the polarization, yes, and there are areas that are very, very marginalized, and they are next to some towns that are very prosperous. But all these examples, they are actually working with what is perceived as negative, and it's turning them, it's turning that very thing into a possible project, yeah. And these negative aspects, they might objectively seem negative, like a decreasing population or the aging of the population. Yeah? So how could you regard that as being positive? Well, because the decreasing population in Romania also means pendling out migration that is also potentially means of a dynamic that could have something, a knowledge, a new knowledge to bring in the town. There is this high rate of vacancies. There is this heterogeneous structure of the city of voids that they create. You mentioned Petrila. And in Petrila, the core of the project was based on an artistic movement, so on creativity, I don't know, innovation and creativity, but that occurred in some vacant structures that by our temporary projects, we were trying to convince that the city could take back, because the city of Petrila was ready to get rid of those structures of the mining of the buildings. Then you mentioned Brăila, where we labeled those interventions as built density replaced by social density. But there are, of course, some other towns that we had as an example, and we tried to present the most recurring examples. Yeah, so a mono-industrial town is an example that you see all over the place. But in Romania, for instance, you also have touristic towns, old spa towns. It might seem very unusual that these towns are shrinking, or you might even have a city that is super shrinking, but that would have all the features to offer a very healthy urban life. So just to conclude, I don't think that there is a universal key in working with shrinkage, and I think that it's even wrong to try to think at it from that perspective. because, but on the other hand, a sort of a universal key would be to diagnose and to understand what those strengths of the town might be that sometimes are probably not in the sight of the administration.
Yeah, thank you. Like the thing that crossed my mind when I was reading about Petrila, it was like you basically made IBA Emscher Park with no top-down funds for it. So it is like a great project, in my opinion.
It's a sort of a guerrilla fight, because I don't know if you are aware of that, but in order for the buildings not to be demolished, we had to put them on the heritage list. So this was the only weapon. So that was the first step to still have the buildings to work with. But then, of course, we were working with temporality, as you said, and I think that's very important, because it's very important for the people to see with their own eyes that something else from the activities that they knew, something that might be very, very different, could happen in some buildings, and that would change the dynamics of their day-to-day life. So I think it's crucial to have scale one-to-one interventions. This doesn't mean, and this might turn into something permanent or not. And this is also important to understand. And in Petrila, we were working actually with both, but from a certain point on, it is crucial for top-down interventions to happen. I mean, all these temporary things, all these small testing of the urban structures, they do work until a certain point. But in Petrila, after 10 years of having worked there, now I think everybody is prepared for a real project, for a more long-term project that would have its flexibility too, but for a real investment, yes.
Thank you. Yes. Well, so according to the model, that maybe it's quite provocative that we are looking for some model, because in my mind I had also that the government should maybe they should prepare some kind of general project. So the question now is to Terry, like with your perspective, time perspective, which lasting over 10 years with helping shrinking cities and supporting them. So have you gotten let's say the school approach or this universal model to supporting them?
Yeah, I think that I kind of fully agree with Ilincą in that there probably isn't a universal model that applies everywhere. Cities shrink for many different reasons and in a lot of different ways. And so the approach needs to be tailored to the specific concerns, both the physical issues and also kind of the social and economic underpinnings. If there's anything, I think, this kind of common thread in many of the communities where we've worked, because as you've mentioned, we work primarily in the Great Lakes region. We have done a little bit of international work just because it informs our practice in an interesting way. But the issues that we see time and time again are really linked to strategic land use and to infrastructure. By strategic land use, I mean that when cities are growing quickly, development happens everywhere because there is development pressure and economic pressure that makes that happen. So in a Great Lakes city, for instance, during the time of peak development, you saw a lot of strange things. Cleveland used to have streams and rivers everywhere before the city was developed, and those things got buried. This is common throughout the older industrial parts of the US. Water got buried into pipes underground and things were built on top, which was never, you know, from an ecological standpoint, a very smart thing to do. Similarly, in like a coastal city, I'm thinking about maybe New Orleans in Louisiana, when the city was experiencing tremendous development pressure, development happened on areas that were below sea level. So not surprising that when a hurricane then hits the city, those low-lying areas are really in harm's way. So the point, I guess, as from strategic land use is that when we have fewer people and more vacancy, can we be more thoughtful and more strategic about where we build and where we don't build? Or should I say where we rebuild, you know, where the infill development and reinvestment goes, and maybe where properties are transformed for ecological purposes, whether that's reforestation or green infrastructure, food production, social connection, parks and green spaces. We can be really more thoughtful about it. In the city of Cleveland alone, there are 30,000 vacant lots, half of which are in a public land bank. So that's a tremendous amount of real estate that is in the public domain. So it isn't about acquiring land, it's already publicly held. So, you know, kind of the common thread I would think in a lot of cities is that when you have site control, can you then begin to impose land use regulations that focus development in the places where it is most ecologically, environmentally sound? And can you take some of that land offline permanently so that we're not rebuilding in places that have inherent vulnerabilities? I think this is especially true. It's been very hard to get public officials to think in that big picture sort of way because it does kind of preference development to certain parts of the city and not in others. But particularly as more cities in the US are experiencing the impacts of climate change through major and very expensive crises, it feels like the local municipalities are beginning to sort of think this way. If you have a building on top of a culvert and it collapses, this is a big crisis. People get hurt and you know, kind of investments are lost. So we're beginning to see little signs that, you know, kind of government officials are starting to think this way. The other part of it around infrastructure is similarly related. We have these large infrastructure networks built for cities that were much larger. We have fewer people that those infrastructure networks are serving, and yet the costs remain the same, actually are increasing. You know, in older cities where the roads begin to fail, where the sewers are facing challenges, you have fewer people to maintain the networks. And so I won't say that it's a universal model, but it's a common problem in all the communities where we have worked is, you know, kind of how you think about infrastructure networks in a way that preserves service, reduces costs, and yet keeps open that opportunity for future redevelopment and growth. Because here in the US, that mindset is very strong. But also, you know, it may seem unrealistic in a city like Detroit or Cleveland that have lost so much population. But a lot of the depopulated cities in the US are in the relatively stable parts of the country. So potentially, Buffalo, the city of Buffalo, New York, which has experienced a lot of population loss, has begun to see climate refugees relocating. And in 2020, the first time in decades, the city actually saw an increase in its population. So I say that only because, you know, maintaining infrastructure networks rather than pulling out infrastructure seems to be the prevalent strategy here because the future is uncertain. And it's hard to convince a public works department to remove something that might prove useful in the not too distant future.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really interesting about the land banking. It's like in Europe, we don't have this kind of, let's say, tool, and a lot of initiatives, like we know from the German experience, that if there was a private ownership, there was impossible to move on with the project. And also with that, I would like to ask you another question, which is because you prepared the urban infill series of publication, and that was touching a lot of aspects of urban development and let's say the urban design. And what is the main message to the shrinking cities for the further implementation of the urban design projects? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's about, you know, kind of these communications, like what we're discussing today. It feels like sometimes that when you look at the challenges of demographic change and transition across the world, that, you know, there's so many differences, political differences, physical differences, but our publication series is really meant to recognize commonalities. I have to say that, you know, kind of our earliest work was extremely influenced by the exhibition that Philippem Oswaltem put together and was kind enough to, you know, kind of allow us to exhibit here in Cleveland before people here were really, for the most part, even thinking about shrinkage. I mean, I remember the response to that exhibition, which was, well, boy, that's too bad for Detroit, you know, because Detroit was featured heavily in the show and people here didn't recognize that we were in the same situation. So the motivation behind our publication series is really about sharing the discoveries that we make here in the in Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, and in the Rust Belt region, sharing this with other places, but also really beginning to understand best practices that are emerging elsewhere because we use them. I mean, kind of the work around urban catalyst and temporary uses was extremely influential and remains influential in our work, as was a project focused in that exhibition, the Fiber Cities Tokyo project, which was all about strategic land use and organizing population density where there was transit infrastructure. So I think that the point of it is just the fact that we're all facing these same challenges in different ways, but these opportunities for sharing and learning from each other are critical because we all have to make a lot of decisions quickly. And so taking advantage of the knowledge of this larger body of work has been really helpful here. And I hope a little bit helpful as we broadcast some of the things that we're doing out to the broader world.
Thank you. So now I would like to ask Philip, with your perspectives, both Stadtumbau Ost and Shrinking Cities project, is there any added value for shaping further projects? Nowadays there are some missing points or gaps in the cities that were beneficiaries or in IBA or Stadtumbau?
Yeah, that is tricky. It was not by coincidence, and also Ilincą was stressing that she kind of made the exhibition in an art context. And so it was no coincidence that the idea for a project was moving from the Ministry of Construction or Building to the Ministry of Culture. And we made several attempts to connect to the Ministry of Construction and also to, on the regional local level. But as a project Shrinking Cities, we never succeeded. So there was some contact and some efforts, but the perspective we took was alienating to them. And that stayed through the course of the project. And the point of our work was, of course, a critique of the Stadtumbau Ost, which was, at least in the beginning, very much about just intervention in the housing market to take superfluous apartments, housing stock from the market by demolition. And we questioned that approach because we said, I mean, the process of shrinkage is not just about the issues of the housing market, it's kind of a larger issue of how to deal with these cities. And they needs kind of other approaches and other perspectives, and not just the emphasis on the interests of the owners of real estate. And that was kind of not appreciated by the Ministry of Construction. Nevertheless, I have to say that, of course, the discourse in Germany changed in the last 2 decades. And I think our work would have some influence, but I think that was a general trend. And I think that there's some development which I really appreciate. And so there is one trend that there is more an actor-based interest in urban development. So there is an understanding that it is not only about the physical substance, but it is about the actors involved. And so many of the questions we try to raise in the context of the shrinking cities are also now raised in the question of booming cities. And we have in Germany, now the kind of larger cities are facing rather housing shortage because there is a shift from the countryside, and also because households are getting smaller and smaller. So there is more consumption of housing, even by a stable amount of people. So they need more apartments because people live in smaller, I mean, just as singles or in smaller households, and so they need more apartments. And also in the context of the growing cities, there is an issue, and there is now starts to be some understanding that you need more actor-based approach. And it's a question who is producing urban conditions. And there is also a question about that the question of ownership is sensitive. So in the context of the shrinking cities, we address the issue that there needs to be a question of the private ownership and the amount of control a private owner has on his or her side. And interesting, I mean, I just can tell, I don't know if you follow the German elections, but in the context of Berlin, yesterday there was also a public decision on the depopulation of housing owners. And it got with 58% yes by the public. So they asked the city of Berlin to depopulate the large housing companies in Berlin, which is quite an amazing statement. Yeah. So there is now in the discourse, so I think there's 3 positive trends. I'm not saying that everything is positive, but there's a positive trend. There is more sensitivity about the actors to be involved. There is now questioning of the question of the ownership. Of course, there is enormous counterforce to keep on the idea of, I mean, it's a political fight, of course. And there is, of course, kind of slowly growing the idea of sustainability and the need to work with the existing housing stock. So there is some pressure, at least from the professional side, I would say, to keep existing buildings, even so they're not to demolish always if something is out of use, or not always to build from scratch if you want something different. So I think that has quite a bit changed from the time when we did the work. And yeah. So, but I have to say that we have been very disconnected from the real politics. There actually want to say one effect. This was more from the Urban Catalyst project. As part of the Urban Catalyst project, we got involved in the interim use of the Palace of the Republic, and this became like a very exposed demonstration how you could reuse a building by temporary use. I think that has changed the mindset of many people, because I mean, the building was so prominent, and it was just a very lucky possibility to can demonstrate that even so we did succeed with the building as such to that it's not demolished and got another use further on, but it demonstrated the quality and the potential of such an approach to many. But it was always critical. I mean, also of course the reuse of the temporary use of the Palace of the Republic, which was a cultural project in liaison with the cultural senator of Berlin and so on. So also something like that could be only initiated from the cultural sphere and not in the context of construction.
Thank you. Like, we are running out of time, but I hope there will be nothing against when if we could prolong it 5 minutes more. There are short questions that I really want to, because I have you all here, so I want and I have to ask them. So yeah, I would not go deeply into the comments, but Ilincą, there is one for you very briefly, that because we've been talking on the first part also about, let's say, suburbanization, and which is very spontaneous and elemental, let's say, the deindustrialization, the population of the cities. And the question is if we could consider it as, let's say, the legacy of the transition in 1990s. Is it like a natural change that we should manage or counteract? What's your opinion?
So if you are asking if the things that happened would have happened anyway, I think that yes. I mean, I think it's just everything that happened could have been predicted and could have been watched and seen. And I believe that in that extent, what happened between East and West Germany was that all the Eastern Bloc should have looked at the relationship between former Eastern and Western Germany, because there the phenomena was very accelerated. But I think that everything that happened in the East as a reaction to the former Iron Curtain was predictable, and that is one thing in dealing with shrinkage that, I mean, besides embracing it, so besides understanding that these are long-term phenomena that are definitely going to happen in one way, but also taking into account the unpredictable that Terry was describing, you know, with the refugees or the pandemic, that pointed out a lot of aspects. Like in Romania, for instance, the pandemics, from my point of view, they gave a second chance to the shrinking cities, because on the one hand, people rediscovered their hometowns because they could work from another place, so they went back home, and then they realized that home was not that bad. And on the other hand, there were even sociologists and anthropologists that were stressing this search for what they call the second home, and that is happening for the over 35-year-old people that are really looking for a moderate urbanity. So for exactly what the shrinking cities in Romania are offering. I mean, you have the infrastructure that could offer the comfort of a town or of a city, but they are but their density and their relationship to nature offers exactly what you are looking for when you want to run away from a large and polluted city. Just to so okay, let me finish that answer. So besides embracing shrinkage and considering the territorial aspects of it, which is hugely important, not to look at your town like this, you really need to think of what's happening in the surroundings and how you could cooperate with the context. It's very, very important to prepare a little bit in advance. And this is exactly what is not happening in the Romanian strategies or politics. So everything that is being done is done with at least one step behind. I mean, although you know what's going to happen and what consequence, and you can guess the consequences that are going to have on the urban social life, but also on the built environment. There was always at least one step behind. And now just a short comment on what Philip said. I'm so glad that that Berlin is taking such I don't know, courageous steps from the public point of view. I mean, and then I've been watching that strategy for a long time, that the city is trying to get that many properties in order to be able to make something more coherent. Now, Terry was describing the exact opposite, that you already have. I mean, the city already has in their possession a lot of places, so they could have better control. And in Romania, and I think that's also in Poland, but I'm not sure, in Romania, more than 90% of the built environment is in private property. And this is something really, really serious. I mean, it's very difficult for the cities or for the state to make something that really counts because of that. And in our project, this has always been the main obstacle. For instance, in Petrila, so there are projects that are waiting to be implemented for 5 years, but because the property issue is not solved, the buildings are just degrade. I mean, they are being more and more ruined. Or we have the situation where a very important building for the town, so like the main building in terms of everything, has 3 different private owners. And some of them owns the land underneath the building, some others own different parts of it. And then the laws do not let you do anything else than the safety. So a project that concerns the structure. So that's the only thing that architects or urban planners can do about it. So yeah, so I believe that property is one of the most important things to take into account.
Yeah, it's also the point that the preparedness that we knew that in some processes that started in the so-called the Western world in the 50s, like the industrialization, the suburbanization, they were manageable from. By now it's 70 years or even longer, and now it happens in the 1990s just suddenly in Eastern Europe, and we knew that it would happen. So we should be, let's say, somehow prepared. But the problem is that the law, jurisprudence changed in that way that we changed completely from the collectivism, like the law was during the let's say the Soviet bloc was oriented to the collectivism. And we turned it very suddenly to individualism. So that was I think the trigger that caused the shock therapy that we also can see in the literature. And we are 9 minutes after the let's say the final ring, but the very last question, and I think it will be kind of summary of our discussion. It will be for Philip. I would like to return to very classic writings. There's one essay that is coming through my mind is Imagining the Nothingness by Rem Koolhaas from 1985. Considering that, and this quotation, where is nothing, everything is possible. Where there is architecture, nothing else is possible. So if the emptiness, the desolation, and it's driving a new development of shrinking cities, should we leave them or wait for a new arising? That's also a bit connected with what you said about the actor-based approach. What's your opinion?
Okay, that is a difficult question. I'm not sure if I would kind of repeat the statement of Rem Koolhaas now after 40 years. I think it was a very good observation at the time, and it was critique of the profession. I mean, we speak about high postmodernism at the time. I think, of course, and then I can just go back to what I said before, that I mean, just the physical condition itself is not completely describing a spatial condition. And so in his sense of this nothingness, this is, of course, there is something. I mean, there are people or there are no people. I mean, there is a social condition, there is a governmental condition, there is a property condition, there's many, many rules. And even so, there is maybe not a physical substance. So I think that we got more sensitivity about that the urban conditions are not just defined by the physical substance. And so I think there is never a question of there is nothing. There is always something. And if you now are more sensitive about like the Anthropocene and the ecological question, there is of course also nature and so on. So I think it is getting more tricky and complex as we kind of dive more into these conditions. As we are at the end, I would also say something, also picking up of what Ilincą and Terry was saying earlier on. I mean, there are many ways of how things shrink and what is shrinking and blah, blah, blah. I think, I mean, at the end of the project, I did, and I still kind of believe in that. I mean, I think that in the future, we will face new patterns and causes of shrinkage. And what is something which is, I think, very apparent already in the US, but also in parts of Europe, is that we have the service sector is changing. And we have a lot of vacancies in the service sector, if it's like shopping malls or office complexes and so on. And so I think these, I mean, we are not just sticking to industrial processes and deindustrialization and so on, and coal mines and, I don't know, steel works, but it can be also an office park or a shopping center. There are already quite a few out which have high vacancies and so on. And it was also interesting what Terry said about Buffalo. So we have a movement of population because of climate change. And so, I mean, these are all, I mean, there's pops. And I think about the economic patterns in 2 decades, we have really little clue. I mean, how globalization is unfolding and nationalist policies as well, so how kind of economies get reorganized spatially, I think it's not to be foreseen. So we will have new phenomena, but I think the subject is kind of becoming more and more important, but in ways we cannot predict.
Thank you. Terry, Ilincą, any last comments in that prolonging session?
Yeah,
sorry.
I was just going to say, I completely agree with what Philip just said. You know, I mean, when we're dealing with so much uncertainty, I think that the tools we're developing in shrinking cities will have applicability far beyond the borders of the places where we're working right now.
Thank you. Ilincą?
I think so too. I also can't help thinking that we are so light years away from the shifts in urban planning that Philip is just describing. So I really hope that the Eastern Bloc is going to try at one point and really see how can they work with this neoliberal status that is overwhelming, at least in Romania. Yes. So.
Yeah. So
I'm a little skeptical, but I also hope that there will be a change that is more profound in the way that we regard, you know, at the very foundation of it, the way we regard in Romania the development, what development actually means.
Like from, say, our perspective of the project that we've been elaborating in Poland, like what I said, like after all this, let's say, case study visitations and so on, like what I said, like my thought is that the shrinking city is giving some kind of, let's say, lesson, and especially that the lesson is for us in the, let's say, the eastern part of the Europe, when we could observe that from the 1990s there was kind of deterioration of the urban planning and the design. And now we have to rethink. Now this is the time. Maybe it's the time has shrunk, so there is no much time. But it's a very harsh lesson for us to change the optics, like to adapt. That we should think out if there is there is not only a growth. That could be a progress, but progress without growth, and also the issue with the climate and the footprint of the architecture and so on. So this is very crucial. And what we can do is also somehow testing we can test some stuff and ideas in the shrinking cities. And for me, is that very, very inspiring in that topic, I guess. So, well, I have to finish the session. We are 70 minutes late, but it was really, it was a great honor to have you here. It was a great pleasure that we have a perspective from the most influential researchers from the US, from Germany, from Romania. Thank you very much for your time, this opportunity that you've been sharing with us, your knowledge and your experiences. Thank you once again, and I hope we will see again one day.
Thanks for the invitation and organizing it. It was very nice to see all of you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, our audience, for the attention. Thank you very much for everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.